Hi, this is Stuart, and I'm making this video in order to say a few words about standards and requirements, which are the kinds of things we have to pay attention to when writing a review. I wanted to talk about this a little bit, one, because some of the readings I think are pretty challenging for this week, the readings on standards, and also because I wanted to make, I hope, a clearer point about the value of writing a software review, not only for this local project, but what that has to do with technical writing. So most immediately, I want to talk about standards because we're going to need standards if we talk about reviews. And we're going to need two sets of standards. One is standards that our readers might want for open source software. In other words, what would make for good open source software? If we're going to write a review and say that something should be recommended, that we would recommend something, or that we wouldn't recommend something, it has to be based on some kind of standard. So one, we have to be able to define what that standard is. And I'll show you toward the end of this video examples of how that happens in a number of places. The second thing, of course, is we're going to need to know what our readers expect from a software review. When they read a review, what are they going to want? That's why I've asked you at the beginning of the week to do that survey on which kinds of reviews you like or not. So to start, from one of the readings that we looked at by John Craven, he opens by saying standards and regulations are at the very core of what makes us human. So you might not have thought about it, but writing a review involves certain kinds of mental abilities that are core of what we do as humans. And so if I could digress for a minute and explain that a little bit, we are of course social beings. We live together, we have to work together, we have to cooperate. This has both some strengths and weaknesses. Now of course it would be easier to live on our own in some ways. So for a polar bear, for example, it's easier just to eat and live alone. You don't have to negotiate power struggles, for example. But the problem is, of course, that we're not polar bears. We're really not capable of living alone like that. We're not wired for it. We're not physically able to do that. So we have to learn to work in groups, just as other animals have learned to work in groups. So what does this have to do with standards? Well, again, standards are a core thing of what we do because they are agreed upon rules for some sort of object or some sort of text. If we're going to work in groups, we need to be able to agree upon certain rules, certain guidelines for things. So standards are core. Now, one of the challenges is that standards tend to be local. Standards in one country are different than in another. Standards in one state are different than in another, which is part of the problem that John Craven writes about when he says that there's a hierarchy, that there are standards that exist at more than one level: the individual, the family, personal networks, national networks, international networks. And the challenge, of course, is that we may do that in one place, but we don't do it in another. So we have to be careful about defining standards that adhere to that group, that work for that group. And of course, when it comes to something like international business, we have to define standards that are going to work internationally. Perhaps to give this a little more realistic kind of application, think about the difference between outlets in different countries. And what you see here are pictures of all sorts of different kinds of outlets. If you've ever traveled overseas, you know that you have to take adapters because the plug that you have to work in the United States does not work somewhere else. The standards are different. So again, we don't do that in one place, we do it in another. The standards change. And thus, as Bowker and Starr point out, a standard can span more than one community. Some standards can begin to reach across. Certainly in the United States, from city to city, the standard for a plug covers many cities, many states. And we have to use these in order to make things work together. If the plug for my computer is going to work in California and in New York, some standard has to be deployed so that I know I can plug in my computer one place or another. Now, not only simple things like plugs, but even large environmental problems may involve standards. If you ever see a recommendation report, there are standards in there. So this is an actual recommendation report from last August, from about a year ago, about water flow. And I just wanted to show you a couple paragraphs. You may want to hit pause here and then look at this for a second. And what I want to point out with this one is that there are some standards for things like riverine flows, base flows, pulse flows. They're going to set standards for the kinds of flows that ought to be maintained. In the report further on, they begin to set what those standards are. So, for example, if you're considering permits, flows should not be, things should not be done during times when flows are below subsistence. They define things, severe periods characterized as the driest 5% of time. So they're starting to define standards for when things can be done, where things can be done. Again, I show you this just to show you an example of how even the software we're writing involves a certain activity of defining standards and trying to figure out which is the best standard, best based on those standards. And this happens over and over again in the world. So again, standards, they can span numbers of communities. A water flow thing even spans different kinds of professions. There are experts in water flow, there are scientists, there are maybe cattle ranchers, farmers, people who do whitewater rafting. There are a lot of people who can be involved, and the standards have to hit all of them. And so we go back to the original question. What kind of standards do our readers want? What are they going to need from open source software? So we're going to define some standards for what makes good open source software for our readers. And second, what do they need from a good software review? When we have to grade the reviews you've written, what kind of standards are we going to use to say that was an excellent review? If you have questions, as usual, let me know.